The Soviets are claimed to have launched the first animal into space. The USA actually launched animals into space first, fruit flies in 1947 and a rhesus monkey in 1949. Claims the Soviets had 500% more hours in space than the Americans. By March of 1965, it was the Soviets with about 500 man-hours and the Americans with only 43. The Soviets did not make any manned flights between the last Voskhod flight in 1965 and the first Soyuz flight in 1967. By 1966, the Gemini flights had put Americans in space for over 1,900 man-hours. While the Soviets did launch the unmanned Luna 15 in July 1969 to return a small sample from the moon, the race was never really close at all. The Soviets didn't launch a successful heavy-lift rocket with the capabilities of putting a manned spacecraft in lunar orbit in the 1960s. The Soviet N-1 was destroyed during 4 launch attempts before the Soviets gave up trying to put a man on the moon. From 1957 to 1965, the Americans outpaced the Soviets in successful orbital launches by over 50%. It was not until 1971 that the Soviets launched their space stations and greatly surpassed the USA in occupying low Earth orbit. The USA did not catch up to the Soviets in low Earth orbit activities until launch of the International Space Station. Even today, the US depends upon Russia to bring American astronauts to the ISS since the space shuttle was retired. Claims that the Soviets could have brought back the first moon rock had their probe not crashed. It is unlikely that Luna 15 would have returned to Earth prior to Apollo 11. The tiny 100-gram Soviet Luna program samples closely matched the Apollo program samples, demonstrating that the American astronauts actually brought back 842 pounds of lunar material. "20 years later, Hubble did not work properly when first put into Earth orbit, but it was eventually serviced and performed very well after repair." Claims U.S. citizens were not informed of the radioactive Van Allen belts. The belts were never a secret. They actually extend from 400 miles to 36,000 miles above the Earth. The South Atlantic anomaly extends as low as 120 miles. Claims all Soviet and American missions were well below the Van Allen belts. Gemini 11 attained a maximum altitude of 739 nautical miles. The space shuttle routinely entered the South Atlantic anomaly portion of the Van Allen belt, as does the International Space Station today. Repeats the claim of the Soviet 5-to-1 time advantage in space. This was only true until early 1965. By 1966, the Americans were ahead of the Soviets in every way regarding manned spaceflight. Claims lead shielding is required to protect the astronauts from the Van Allen belt radiation. The journey through the edge of the belt to and from the moon took about 6 hours. Lead is a poor choice of shielding in the belts as it results in secondary ionizations that will increase the astronauts' radiation exposure. On short duration flights like Apollo, limiting time and flying along the edge of the belts is more effective than shielding. Claims the Saturn V weighs as much as a battleship. The 365-foot tall Saturn V weighs about 3,200 tons. A 1960s era battleship weighs about 42,000 tons. Claims adding lead shielding will keep the Saturn V from taking off. The Saturn V can launch 53 tons to lunar orbit and 155 tons to low Earth orbit. Lead shielding could have been added, but this would have reduced the amount of mass taken into lunar orbit. The decision was made to use aluminum and other shielding material instead. Claims the inability to shield astronauts was why the Soviets only sent unmanned probes to the moon. The Soviets were unable to develop a heavy launch vehicle that could send a manned lunar spacecraft to the moon. Claims Apollo shielding was made from thin aluminum. This is partly true. The aluminum hull was thin, but it was not the only shielding on the command module and lunar module. Claims the radiation level in low Earth orbit was so high that the astronauts saw flashing lights in their eyes. This was the result of passing through the lower portions of the Van Allen belts. It was not life-threatening, as the typical skin dose the astronauts received was about 430 mg per mission. Compare this to the allowed 5,000 mg per year for radiation workers at nuclear power plants in the United States. Claims that the goal of landing on the moon was irrevocable. Kennedy did, in fact, consider canceling Apollo and working with the Soviets. After his death, Johnson continued the Apollo program. Claims the Saturn V and ICBMs are very similar. Apollo era and modern ICBMs such as the Titan and Minuteman do not use cryogenic fuels. They use hypergolic fuels or solid fuels that can be stored at room temperature. Claims that various Soviet space firsts kept them ahead in the space race for good. The United States put the first animals in space. The first American in space was launched less than a month after the Soviets put Gagarin in orbit. The first American spacewalk was less than 3 months after the first Soviet spacewalk. The Soviet flight had 3 cosmonauts without spacesuits and was a dangerous publicity stunt. The first 2 Soviet spacecraft in orbit together did not rendezvous as they were actually in different orbits. Gemini 6 and 7 successfully rendezvoused in 1965. Gemini 8 docked with an Agena rocket in 1966. The USA was far ahead of the Soviets during the Gemini program. Claims it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race and therefore in weaponry. The US had outperformed the Soviets in the space race in every way by 1966. Claims the Apollo program was intended merely to plant a flag on the moon. Actually, much more was done. Photos were taken, experiments deployed, and samples brought back for study. Claims correctly that Tethys satellites were used for training ground crews. But the Tethys satellites were also low Earth orbit satellites. They could not simulate data coming from anywhere but Earth orbit. Claims these satellites could be used to fool ground controllers. The time delay for voice transmissions from the Earth to low Earth orbit and back is different than the delay for a spacecraft traveling to the moon. This would have been noticed. Claims that Apollo images were tightly controlled. Nearly all of the Apollo program photos, film, and video are readily available on the internet for anyone to view. Claims NASA was asked for photos of the astronauts on the lunar surface, but received few photos with many duplicates. There are at least 30 photos of Buzz Aldrin on the lunar surface. These photos may be viewed online at the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. Claims that many more photos could have been taken. This claim is correct. Over 500 photos were taken at other times during the Apollo 11 mission. Over 120 photos were taken while on the lunar surface. The astronauts were busy with other activities besides photos. Correctly claims that there is only one photo of Armstrong on the moon. Disappointing perhaps, but not suspicious. Claims Armstrong feared liability for his role in Apollo. Avoiding a photo would not protect anyone from participation in a conspiracy if Apollo 11 was a hoax. Claims Armstrong does not give interviews. This is not true at all. Various interviews given by Armstrong are easy to find on the internet. Claims direct sunlight was the only source of lighting on the moon. The objects in the photos were actually lit by direct sunlight and sunlight reflected off of the lunar surface. Claims all shadows run parallel on any landscape. This video capture proves this claim is wrong. The yellow lines are not drawn parallel. On flat ground, shadows and lines in a two-dimensional photo tend to converge in the distance. Shadows on terrain that is not flat appear to go in wildly varying directions as shown in Cybrell's video. Claims that shadows cast in different directions indicate a second light was used. If a second light was used, there would be 2 shadows. This is not an isolated hotspot. The lunar surface varies in color and reflectivity. Claims his astronaut is brightly lit. The astronaut is rather dimly lit up by sunlight reflecting from the lunar surface. Same light reflecting from the lunar surface. Claims this is a composite photo as the crosshair should always be visible. The crosshairs only fade away when they appear against a white object. This is not unusual at all. Claims that the 10,000 pounds of thrust at landing will make a crater. A burn crater is not expected. The surface is firm and only the dust is expected to blow away. The lunar module engine is throttled down to far less than 10,000 pounds thrust prior to landing as the fuel is burned away. 5 Surveyor spacecraft soft landed on the moon from 1964 to 1968 without crater problems. This is obviously not the latest specifications or scientific data. Claims dust is expected to appear on the landing pads. The lunar module engine typically blew the dust away prior to landing. The engine was shut down just prior to landing after the 5-foot-long contact probes touched the lunar surface. Dust does not billow out in a vacuum, but instead flies outward and settles far away. Claims the astronauts should frequently talk about the stars while on the moon, but do not. The astronauts did mention them extensively, as can be seen when reviewing mission transcripts. The astronauts were able to use their sextant, which had 2 telescopes incorporated into it to navigate by the stars, but their primary focus was on the moon. Sabrell does not understand why a handheld camera is not suitable for star photography. Apollo 16 took many photos of the lunar sky. Here is one of them. Claims that a photographic telescope was not taken to the moon. Large telescopes would have been impractical on Apollo. The far ultraviolet camera was carried on Apollo 16. It used a 3-inch telescope to obtain 178 images at wavelengths between 500 and 1600 angstroms. Claims the flag was blowing in the wind on a film stage. The flag only moves when an astronaut is touching the flag or the flagpole. The flag movement quickly slows down and stops after the astronaut lets go. Another claim about air conditioning on a film stage. There is never any evidence of air currents in the film and video taken on the lunar surface. This can be seen by the lack of lunar dust hanging above the moon's surface when disturbed by footsteps or the lunar rover. The dust quickly falls back to the surface instead. Massive ventilation and air conditioning would have created dust clouds. Claims slow motion video is responsible for the appearance of 1/6 lunar gravity. Try viewing other film of the lunar surface at a higher rate of speed, and this will reveal that the astronauts' arm movements are unrealistic. Correctly claims that a color video camera was used on the command module and a black and white camera was used on the lunar surface. Video equipment and bandwidth limitations dictated the types of video cameras that could be used in the command module and on the lunar surface. Sabrell makes a big deal about supposedly newly discovered raw footage of the Apollo crew faking the translunar injection while in low Earth orbit. This footage is not newly discovered. The footage as it appears in this video is edited instead of showing it as it was originally broadcast. This footage is available online for anyone to view without these misleading edits and commentary. Correctly states that James Webb retired prior to Apollo 7. James Webb was a political appointee who retired at age 62. This is not unusual or suspicious. Correctly states that the Apollo 11 astronauts resigned from NASA shortly after they returned to Earth. Several Apollo astronauts resigned from NASA after their lunar missions. Considering the long training schedules and time away from family, this is not unexpected.